Right, well, we're going to be talking a bit about Joshua today. If you've been doing the church reading plan, then you would have read through a bunch of Joshua this week. And Joshua's a great book. It's one of my favourite books. Joshua's one of my favourite characters, probably because, he's actually one of the people that lives out almost all the time, for a couple of occasions. Most of the time he lives out what we would just love to live out. Now, that life of someone who's just committed to God and just wants to be doing all he can. I love Joshua. So we're going to be doing Joshua 4. And before we get to that, though, do you know that the mind, under normal circumstances, the mind cannot remember physical sensations? It's interesting, isn't it? You can remember that you had them, and you can remember the emotions around them, but you can't remember the physical sensation themselves. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hang on, I broke my arm once or whatever, and I can remember it was pretty painful, yeah? So what's Mick talking about? Well, I'll give you an example. If we could actually remember it, as in it came back into our mind, then whenever a woman thought of giving birth to her child, chances are she'd probably double over. Because that would be remembering the pain, right? It would come back on them. If you broke your arm, you'd remember breaking your arm, and suddenly you'd grab your arm and you'd be seeking medical assistance because you'd remember how much it is. You can remember it was broken. You can remember the fact that it was painful. You can remember a lot of things about it, a lot of the emotions around it, but you can't actually remember physical sensations. It's one of those very clever things that God's made sure, otherwise we would all be walking around, you'd think of something, and you'd either be in raptures or you'd be in pain, doubled up depending on what you were thinking of. Imagine if, you get told a joke. Imagine, think of a really funny joke when you get told it the first time and you laugh, right? It's a bit of an involuntary thing, you laugh. Imagine if every time someone told that joke, you remembered that sensation, you just laughed again. And then they tell again, you laugh. Tell again, laugh. Tell again. Like, of course, now, probably after the second time, you're sort of, But imagine that's what it would be like. If we could remember physical sensations, then that's what it would. Now, of course, we can remember emotions. We can remember them really well. We can remember emotions like fear and happiness all the time. There's the whole idea of smiling at the thought of something, isn't it? So you remember something, it's sort of happy, and you find yourself maybe smiling a little bit when you're thinking about it. So you can remember emotions really well. If you can think about something that makes you scared, right? And maybe it's a movie you've seen, and sometimes when you think about that movie again, like you get that sort of weird prickly feeling where the hair stands up on your arms, right? Because you're remembering that emotion. You're being affected by that emotion the same way you're affected it before. But the fact is, the human being, it can't remember physical sensations as much as we can remember we had them. In fact, we have remarkably short memories for creatures that are at the top of the creation scale. I'll give you an example. The sea lion, for instance, they did a scientific study on sea lions, and one of the things they had a sea lion named Rio, and a university got with the sea lion and these trainers, and they taught him to respond to symbols. So they'd show up symbols, and he would pick the matching symbols, if you know what I mean. This is the trick they taught him. And if he got it right, he'd be rewarded. So he learnt the trick. They didn't do that trick again with him for 10 years. 10 years later, they came back and they did a similar trick. Not the exact trick, but they did the same thing using numbers and letters. And they found that he instantly recalled the trick and was able, after 10 years of not having done the trick ever again, he was instantly able to do it. Can you imagine for us, like humans, we just can't do that. Imagine if you had a skill and 10 years later, you went and did it perfectly again without even having to think about it again. Well, this is what sea lions are like. So when you consider us compared to sea lions, to be honest, our memory's pretty poor. And there's actually a whole swag of animals that have much better memories than we do. We have very poor memories, really, considering we're at the top of the pole. And probably the things we have our poorest memory for are our mistakes, aren't they? When you think about your mistakes and you keep making the same mistake over and over again, that's because we have a poor memory for mistakes. I mean, how many times do we think we've learnt from the mistake and then we do it again? Especially maybe if you're someone who runs off a bit at the mouth, right? And maybe you say things that aren't exactly the most tactful thing, and you'll say that. I remember once, and I'm not going to mention the names because it's too painful, but there was a friend, I went through the academy with a girl, and she was a lovely girl, but I was very judgmental at the time, and I didn't think she was very bright. And anyway, we were in a group of people, and we were talking, and someone mentioned that she'd got engaged. And I said, oh, this girl, she's so dumb. I said, oh, she's like so silly. She called her own name out at a role model. Like she's reading out the role, and she called her own name out, right? And I'm telling this story, and I was so judgmental, it was horrible. Anyway, we see, and my mate next to me is elbowing me, going, "She's not that bad, mate. She's not that bad." And I'm going, "Yes, she is." Well, across the group, there's about 8 of us in the group. A guy there, he says, "Yep, I'm engaged to her." You'd think I'd learn from that, wouldn't you? Right? But I can give you a litany of those examples where, I've just did the wrong thing at the wrong time. I'm really bad at learning about my mistakes. I'm getting better. I think age helps. But certainly, when I was in my early 20s, forget it. I was just a walking wrecking ball. It was terrible. And sometimes they become really ingrained, don't they? Sometimes ingrained habits become really hard to break, even though they might be harmful to us or they might be mistakes. They become habitual and they're really hard for us to break. Well, Joshua, finally we've got to the point where hopefully we're over all the mistakes. The Israelites, unfortunately, have the shortest memories of all. And as we've read in Genesis and Exodus, and we've gone through the various books, finally we've hit Joshua and God has cleared the decks. He's finally got rid of all those fools who up until that point just kept forgetting all the time. They would do the wrong thing and they'd, "Oh, we're sorry," and then they'd come back, "Oh, do the wrong thing again, we're sorry." You're getting sick of it, weren't you? Let's face it. You're reading through the book and you're getting a little bit frustrated with them. And finally hit Joshua and God has cleared the decks off and we have what is called the faithful generation. That's certainly, there was the disobedient generation, and this group are sort of known in collective scholarly terms as the faithful generation. So where are we in the story? Well, we're at the beginning of the book of Joshua. The Israelites have arrived and they're about to go into the promised land. It's the one that had been promised back in Genesis. It's not their whole inheritance. In fact, they've been living on part of their inheritance already, which is east of the Jordan River. That's part of their inheritance, but the promised land of Canaan they're about to go into. The rebellious generation is gone. This new generation has come in, the new faithful generation. So we're going to expect big things from these guys, aren't we? Or are we? Right. Well, 40 years in the wilderness, Moses is dead, Joshua's the leader. They're going to cross the river, and Joshua gets a word from God on how to do that. And what they do is they send the ark forward, and they move the ark towards the Jordan River. And as they step into the river, the water parts, and they walk into the middle of the river, and they stand there, and it banks all the way. It banks up. The river banks up. I'm going to show you a photo in a little while about that. It's a pretty impressive river. So it banks up, okay? And, of course, they then walk through. The river stops flowing, and then they get to walk through the nice dry river. So we're going to read out of Joshua 4 from verses 1 to 11, and we're going to see what happens. When all the people had crossed the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Now choose 12 men, one from each tribe. Tell them, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan. Carry them out and pile them up at a place where you will camp tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he'd chosen, one for each of the tribes of Israel. He told them, "Go into the middle of the Jordan, in front of the ark of the Lord your God. Each of you must pick up one stone and carry it on your shoulder, 12 stones in all, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. We will use these stones to build a memorial. In the future, your children will ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' You can tell them. They remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the ark of the Lord's covenant went across. These stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever." So the men did just as Joshua had commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River, one for each tribe, just as the Lord had told Joshua. They carried them to the place where they camped for the night and constructed the memorial there. Joshua also set up another pile of 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan at the place where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing. And they are there to this day. The priests who were carrying the ark stood in the middle of the river until all the Lord's commands that Moses had given to Joshua were carried out. Meanwhile, the people hurried across the riverbed, and when everyone was safely on the other side, the priests crossed over with the ark of the Lord as the people watched. And of course, what happens, of course, is the river keeps flowing again. It resumes its normal course, and they go and they camp, and there's a bunch of things. It's a pretty cool story, really. God does this miracle. Everyone sees it. This is the new faithful generation, righto? This is something big's going to happen. They're all pretty good. I mean, what we expect from this generation is that they're ready for war. They're going to go to war very soon, and we think they're ready for war. They're on fire. You know that they've been looking forward to doing God's mission. Their parents. I mean, let's face it. How many people think their parents did life well? Hardly any of us, right? So all those parents are gone, and now the young, smart ones are coming in, righto? Because the parents were just too old to know everything, and this new group's coming on. Well, is it just as straightforward as we think? Are they really as faithful a generation as we sort of tend to think of them? Well, let's have a look at this particular account. See, I think Joshua didn't think they were as faithful as we probably think they were. Let's have a look at some of the things he did. Well, I think he knew very well that just like their parents, this generation had short memories as well. I mean, he'd seen that with the previous generation. So not only does he build one memorial, but he builds two memorials. It's like he's doubling his sort of chances of anyone remembering anything, isn't it? The first one he builds at the place where they camp. It's a place called Gilgal. And Gilgal's a very special place for the Israelites. Gilgal became the centre of worship for the Israelites until the temple in Jerusalem was built. And then the temple in Jerusalem became the centre of worship. Gilgal, occasionally it was sort of corrupted and it became a centre of demon worship, and a few things happened. But generally Gilgal was the centre of religious activity for the Israelites until they got themselves into Jerusalem. And so it was a very important place. They did a bunch of different things when they were in Jerusalem, and so it made sense then, in Gilgal rather, so it made sense then that for the generations to come, they would see this 12-stone memorial that would be sitting there, and they would understand what this incredible miracle that God had done for them, and it was a memorial about God's power. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Erect it in the place it's going to become the centre of your religious activity for the next couple of hundred years until Jerusalem eventually becomes the place. So where was the second one built? Well, the second one built is in the middle of the river, isn't it? He says the second one of 12 stones, and listen, these stones are carried by one man, so they're not big stones, are they? They're going to be, I don't know how big the Israelites were. They might have been pretty beefy sort of guys. They probably could carry some decent stone, but probably, a Besser brick-sized stone is about as good as it's going to get for one guy to cart it, especially from the river's edge out to Gilgal. That was a big effort. And so, it's probably 12 stones. They weren't the biggest stones. But to be honest, piling a mere 12-stone high pile of rocks in the middle of the river is hardly an enduring statement. If you think about it, here's a photo of the Jordan River. Now, this was taken a while ago. It's a black and white photo, as you can see. This is at about the same place. It's currently a place called Allenby Bridge, is about where they crossed over, just near Jericho. Is what's known as Allenby Bridge today. That's Allenby Bridge there. You can see the bit of it there. So you can see it's quite a wide river, and it's in flood, just like in this photo. So in Joshua 3, it tells us that it's in flood. So they're crossing the river in flood, and so this is it. Just like it floods on a regular basis. The Jordan River, it floods generally at about harvest time, and so this is what it would have looked like at about this thing when they crossed over. So you can imagine then that unless God does another miracle, no one's ever going to see that memorial, are they? Like once they put 12 rocks in the middle of that and the river goes back over the top, who's ever going to see that again? I mean, for all we know, it's still there. There might be 12 rocks sitting there in the middle of the river that haven't been moved anywhere. For all we know, they're going to still be there. No one's going to see it once the water flows, isn't it? I mean, it makes no sense really when you think about it. Why would you pile rocks up in the middle of a river that you can't see? It makes perfect sense to put it at Gilgal. Everyone's going to see that for generations. But clearly, that's what Joshua did. In addition, you notice it said that God told Joshua to build the memorial at Gilgal, but it pretty much doesn't say that. It says he told them to build the memorial at the river. So there's something going on here, isn't there? There's something a little bit different about these two memorials. Why put a bunch of rocks in the river? I mean, maybe if you're fording across the river, maybe you'll run into it. But I mean, maybe you're gonna find it that way. But most of the time, no one is going to know it's there unless you're trying to go across back again. So clearly, this isn't a memorial that's going to be enduring for the rest of the people, is it? The only people who are going to remember that are the people that actually crossed. This memorial is actually just for those who crossed the river, only for their generation, because no one else is going to get it. The kids of all these people, they're not going to know that the rocks are in the river. This particular memorial, even though the other one's an enduring one, this is all about just the people that crossed. So why would Joshua do that? Well, the bottom line is Joshua knows that it's going to be very tempting for them to cross back over that river. That's why he's putting a memorial there, and it's a memorial that's not going to last beyond that generation, but that's okay for Joshua. He wants to affect the guys who are very likely to turn tail and head back over the river. And who would do that? Well, the tribe of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh, their land is on the eastern side of the river. They've been told they have to go and fight with everyone else, but mum and the kids are all on the other side of the river, right? So that's one group of people that are thinking, wouldn't mind a bit of shore leave every now and again, might just nip over to the other side of the river. Obviously, memorial is going to be there. It's going to remind them. The other group, of course, is going to be the people that think maybe life's getting pretty tough and maybe it's going to be a lot better if we just nip back into the outside the promised land. I mean, Canaan, there's iron chariots, there's all sorts of crazy people there. There's giants. Like, who wants to fight giants? I don't mind fighting giants because, you just drop bombs on them these days. It doesn't matter too much how big they are. In fact, it makes them more of a target when they're really big. But in those days, when you had to actually fight someone with a sword or a spear, giants were a problem. Well, there were lots of giants over there. No one wanted to go there. They had a lot of crazy stuff coming up. In fact, Joshua had to draw a line in the sand because he was about to ask the people to do some pretty amazing stuff. He was about to ask them, let's have a look at what they were going to do. Well, for a start, he was going to ask them to all be circumcised. That's the first thing they did when they got across there. Well, I don't know about you, but who thought up that as a requirement to get into a social group? How's that going to sell at the annual general meeting? When you raise that one, I think the entry fee is going to be circumcision. It's just not going to pay, is it? It's just not going to be. It's not a great. Clearly, it was a great idea because God put it in there. But I'm just saying, as a man, Joshua is going to be asking him to do some stuff. He's going to be asking them to attack Jericho. Jericho is the biggest fortress in the area. They're going for the hardest nut first. They could have done everything else, all the little ones first, and then gone for Jericho later and try to starve them out or something or other, or maybe cut a deal with them later. Nah, Joshua's taking them straight to the hardest nut on the place. He's going for the biggest walls, the biggest army. He's going straight for Jericho, and he's going to be asking them to do that. Joshua's about to ask them to do a whole bunch of stuff, and he knows it's going to be very tempting for a whole bunch of them to head back to mum and the kids or to just go back to their previous lifestyle. And so he's put a memorial in the river there. It's going to be a memorial that's going to only come to mind of this one generation, and they're going to remember it whenever they cross the river. What other reasons maybe aren't they as faithful as we think? Well, we know that the people were nervous. Hang on, Mick, you say there wasn't anything in that passage when we read about them being nervous? All right, let's have a look at verses 10 and 11. The priests who were carrying the ark stood in the middle of the river until all the Lord's commands that Moses had given to Joshua were carried out. Meanwhile, the people hurried across the riverbed. And when everyone was safely on the other side, the priests crossed over with the ark of the Lord as the people watched. Did you know what it said there? The people hurried across. Now, that sort of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, the water's rolled back. You're crossing a river. You don't really know if it's going to roll back again. Maybe this is just one of those weird coincidences. The tide went out up in the Sea of Galilee or something. I mean, who knows, right? And so maybe they're thinking, let's not push things too much. God's doing some miracles, but let's just not ask him for too much. Let's hurry across. Now, you might be saying that's a bit of a stretch until you have a look at the word here. The Hebrew here for hurried across is the one that they pair with the idea of anxiousness. Now, we do this all the time. For instance, I could say to you, he ran away, or I could say he fled. Now, when you translate that, you could end up with either of those ideas. But when I say ran away and fled to you, you get different ideas, don't you? But depending on which word I choose. Fled seems a lot more a lot of desperate, isn't it? If someone flees, it's much more different than when they run away, isn't it? Well, it's the same idea here. The word they're using here for hurry is the one that gets paired with the idea of anxiousness. So if we were to say it, that what we'd be saying is that they were anxiously hurrying across the river. And I suggest that the reason they're anxiously hurrying across the river is that they're not anxious to get circumcised. That's just my guess. I think they're anxiously hurrying across because they're worried about the river coming back on. They're really worried about the river. Maybe they thought it was this, they were just going to get lucky and get halfway across and then God's sort of grace has run out now. It's all coming back. Maybe that's what they were worried about. But clearly there was something that this faithful generation weren't quite as faithful as we think. Maybe they're not quite as sold out as we had thought. And to be fair, like I said, they're going to be doing some pretty crazy stuff. They're going to be attacking the hardest place to go. And guess what? When they actually get there, how are they going to attack it? They're not going to do what they normally did in those days. Normally you'd put about a 6-month siege around the place and you'd run them out of water. That's generally what they tended to do back in those days. No, we're going to march around it with trumpets. Yeah, I've spent a bit of time in the army. I'm trying to think how I'd respond to that if that was what I was told that was the plan. We're going to go over to this enemy and we're going to march around it with trumpets. That's the plan. I think I'd probably be asking for this guy to get, moved on sideways. So they're going to be asked to do some pretty crazy stuff when they get there. I think they actually have good reason to be nervous. I actually think the Israelites here have good reason. When you think about what they're about to do, as faithful as they are, they've got good reason to be nervous. I don't think we should judge them. I don't think we should judge them that they need memorials at all. I don't think we should look at them and say, hey, they need a memorial that's going to last into the future. And, they needed a memorial back at the river to stop them crossing back over to their lives, the previous life and previous existence. I don't think we should judge them at all, because even though they had short memories of God's gracious provision, yep, got that, they did that. Maybe they had, they needed these physical memorials. But the bottom is the memorials actually worked for a while. That was a good thing. None of them actually did cross back over the river. And they did, for a while, remain quite faithful to what God had done for them. But the bottom line is, are we really so different? Are we really so different as these guys? How often do we revisit the amazing things God does for us? Or God does amazing stuff in our lives and we just sort of file it away and we move on? How often do we consider the amazing things God does? And so how often do we consider the amazing miracles He does that we just take for granted? Look at penicillin. 1928, they discover penicillin. Discover, probably a toss-up. And as a result of that, you get a major infection, and the chances are you've got a pretty good chance of recovery these days because of the advent of penicillin. For the rest of the thousand years until 1928, you're probably going to die. That's just the bottom line. Leading cause of death up until 1928, infection. Leading cause of death after 1928, heart disease. What can you say? It's our diet's killing us. But up until then, it was infection. You get an infection. I probably would be dead 3 or 4 times over for the infections I've had. I've had, appendicitis, all this sort of stuff, all of which got treated by penicillin and the derivatives, and without that, I probably wouldn't have lived. The bottom line is, do we ever look at that? Do we ever go to the doctor and he gives us a script and we take it, we go away and we go, wow, that was good. That was God's miracle right there. Do we do that, or do we tend to think that it was a result of just what we consider to be normal stuff? How normal was it for the Israelites just to walk across that riverbed? Probably after a while, after God's doing incredible stuff for them, they're defeating, they walk around, the walls crash down in Jericho. At one point, Joshua stops the sun. I mean, there's some amazing miracles God can do. I wonder how much after a while these guys are going, sun stopped. Of course it would, But they always had the memorial to go back to, didn't they? They had the memorial in Gilgal that they would go back, which would remind them, which their kids would say, what's the pile of stones for, Dad or Mum? And they'd be able to tell them. Where are our memorial stones when God's doing incredible stuff for us? I'm not talking about actually physically memorial stones. I'm not saying we should set up memorial stones here or anything, or, there's a cross on the wall over there, that should be a memorial stone. No, I'm not saying that at all. Right? That's not what we're talking about. What I'm saying is, where are our spiritual, our internal memorial stones from our experience? Maybe that's something we need. Maybe it would be really handy if every now and again, when we're starting to take for granted the incredible things that God does for us, we get to walk past the memorial stones and go, hey, look at that. And when our children say, that's pretty amazing, Dad, what's that? Well, that's God, I wonder how many times we need memorial stones to keep our faith strong and to focus on God. Maybe we need memorial stones to stop us going back. Maybe we need memorial stones buried in the river too, to stop us going back and sort of revisiting parts of our lives that we really are over. I think I've said before, preaching in the church, that sometimes I think what we can do is, God does something in our lives and it sort of raises our faith. Maybe we go from the first floor to the second floor. And so all too often, we then take the escalator straight back down to the first floor. God's, I really needed that job. He got me that job. I'm really praised. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. That's great. Oh, man, I'm not feeling well. There's no way I can get healed of that. Oh, God's healed me. That's great. Thank you. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Oh, my relationship with this person is not going well. There's nothing to be done about that. See what I mean? Going up to the second level, you'd think you'd be, your faith's been raised, and too often I do this all the time, we just jump on that escalator and straight back down to the bottom floor again. Well, maybe some memorial stones can help us a little bit. So how are we going to do that practically? Well, there's a whole bunch of different practical ways you can do that. I mean, if you're a diary person, things like a prayer diary, that sort of stuff are great for that. You've got to go back over it, of course, every now and again. Maybe even share it with someone. Maybe set it up a bit like a memorial stone. Wow, look at all this incredible stuff. And we're seeing some great stuff in the church. Last week, a quarter of the prayer requests that came out of the congregation last week were praise points for answers to prayer to things that we'd been praying for that had come out of the congregation. A quarter of them. How incredible is that? Where's the memorial stone? On Tuesday, I think Lex is going to be building a memorial stone out to, all these things. God is doing some amazing stuff for us. We really should be, I think, putting some memorial stones, spiritual memorial stones in place so we don't ever forget what we're going to do.